And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our next two speakers for the session this afternoon, Mary Tobin and John Stafford. The reason why I'm so interested in the work that they've been doing is, with three teenagers myself, that relationship that I have built with my children's school has really been invaluable and extremely rewarding. The combined experience of both Mary and John and their commitment to acknowledging that schools have a profound influence on the lives of young people and the important place that the school community plays in their lives is valuable for all of us in this room today. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the program that they're working on. Thank you.
Thanks, Serena. And where are you, John? After this wonderful dialogue that's been happening today, John and I, in a space of about 1 minute, have just kind of reshaped this presentation a little bit. And so what we'll try to do in a very short period of time is look at the planning and the thinking that's gone behind the work that we're engaged in, which is very similar to the work that many people here are engaged in, to then look closely then, so what has the Family School Partnership Initiative really been about? And then most importantly, the reason we're all here, then to think about, so where to from here and what does it mean, both for us and for all of us in dialogue. So thanks for being here on a Friday afternoon at 3:30. It was interesting this morning when we started, and I felt really gifted to be here and hear from Helene, in that she spoke so strongly about the premise of all of this work being the research, which is absolutely clear that if we're going to redress and address equity and achievement in education in Australia and really be quite serious about addressing that gap, and more importantly, and just as importantly, to build stronger communities where all people have a sense of belonging and place, the role of parents, parent engagement, is absolutely central. But in some ways, John and I this afternoon would like to challenge that, although we say it's clear and it's essential, from a systems point of view, what's different? And so if we think about other areas, for example, the research around literacy and how literacy is so vital and that all young people need to be engaged in literacy. And yet if we went along to a sampling of schools across Australia or into jurisdictions and had conversations with system leader and asked them how this was positioned, where's the strategy, where's the investment, where's the staff, where's the thinking, where are the resources? And if some of those people said in response, well, yes, that is important, but we'll think about that next, or that is important, we might do that later on, they wouldn't exist. So where we're starting from this afternoon is where Helene began this morning, but challenging that view that across Australia, particularly at a systems level, where is this work located? So our simple story, our sharing today, which is just like the journey being shared right across this room all day, is saying, here's what we've been trying to do to challenge that assumption. And so the very nature of a focus on family school partners was around that notion of being disruptive, saying that if the reform was really being listened to, and if we see educational reform as a pie graph, with the drivers of really looking at equity and achievement in quite different ways, the notion of parent engagement has to be in there at the same time, not as an added extra. And so the notion of disruptive innovation is what's been guiding our conversations. If we're serious about really looking at achievement and equity, what are we doing differently? And how do we force that agenda? Because if we go around in an invitational way only and add on and do more PL and have some additional resources and keep talking about the wonderful things that many schools across Australia are doing, people will remain comfortable. So very much using the wonderful Smarter Schools National Partnerships Initiative, we were challenged to think about how can we disrupt and interrupt what's currently happening at a systems level. And so that's where we started from. And so beginning from that premise, John and I and others had some fairly uncomfortable times and then brokered conversations across the levels of system. Because very often in systems, when we're looking at achievement and equity, we come back to old paradigms. We go back into the classroom, we go back into literacy, we go back into professional learning for teachers, we go back to, and with the best of intentions, we ask ourselves, What's something we can do? What's the one thing we can do? Let's go back to, so we look for short-term turnaround, and we look for magic bullet solutions, or we look for the next bit of evidence that'll drive forward the change. We don't do that because we don't care. We do that because we care, really essentially. But we're systems people and we want to make a difference quickly. And so this was challenging that. This was saying through the Smarter Schools National Partnership reform agenda, and very much in concert with what our own system was saying, that we really did want to redress these inequities in educational outcomes. How can we do it differently? And so this initiative was premised on the fact that it couldn't be a singular approach, it couldn't be seen as a program, it had to actually shake us to the core and be quite disruptive. And so in exploring that notion, we said, well, what are the levels of interventions? What are the levels of discomfort? What are the levels of discussions that we have to shake up? If this doesn't become another funding period, another project, that in 5 years or 7 years we'll go back to our business and go back to the same discussions around learning. So it had a number of elements and it had a number of levels. At the levels, we looked at the system, the internal policy and research arm of the system and central office area. We also looked at the regions where the delivery is often happening to support the schools, particularly around school improvement, and we looked at the schools. And so in terms of looking at how can we use it as a bit of a catalyst to be quite disruptive around innovation that was needed and that we can't apologise anymore for, that these inequitable outcomes are not acceptable, we engaged in the Family School Partnership Initiative, and John will talk soon about the details around some of that. The focus wasn't about parent engagement on its own. The focus was coming back in to drive literacy and numeracy improvements through looking at the research, which has to be engaged with at a systems level if we're going to look at literacy and numeracy in different ways. We also wanted to, and it's been touched on this morning, so how do we look at the new people coming into the profession of teaching so that this becomes just their bread and butter? So we engaged in a partnership with Australian Catholic University in Melbourne, worked with them on a customised Master of Education program where, when we think about the pie graph elements again, parent engagement is embedded into the course. We don't know whether we've done that perfectly yet. We're still learning all the time. So it's reflective practice. How can we reshape both pre-service education and post-grad education around this important area? And so ACU have been very willing and able partners, not in getting it right, because we haven't got that, but in ongoing professional dialogue. But we knew we needed that arm as well if we were about system reform and not just about a program. And so we're also about leadership formation, leadership at a whole variety of levels, leadership in the system, leadership in regions, leadership in schools, meaning all of the people that can really drive change and new understandings. And we knew if we were going to be completely disruptive, it meant that we had to explore what do we let go of, what do we reshape, so that if we looked back on this period of reform and we were true to the government's agenda, when we go back to central offices, when we go back to regions, when we go back to schools, what's different in terms of the nature of the staffing, the nature of the focus points. So we start to simplify what we're doing because we've got greater clarity around the things that make the difference. And so therefore what's left behind in terms of the structures of staffing, the structures of the bureaucracies in which we work at the regional level, at the central level, what's in place in schools and what's the dialogue. And so just before I pass to John, the questions that were driving the disruptive innovation, the questions that we were engaged in learning together and knowing that we didn't have the answers even though we had the research, we know that research on its own won't drive change. It's how we engage with the research and what it means. And so we know that that is disruptive. So the questions that we felt really needed exploration at those three levels and across school communities was to go back to the basic premise about what is the nature of learning? How do we learn? Now, we know the research tells us that now, and we know that's been shared a lot. But we'd argue in many systems, or many people within systems may acknowledge it, but what are they doing as a response to it? So really, what's the emerging narrative across each of our systems and across Australia around the very nature of learning, how and where it occurs? And then looking very purposefully at where does learning occur and what does it mean? So the in-school factors and the out-of-school factors, which have already been referred to today, are really examined. So the language and the conversations which we're often part of, which are really sincere around how do we drive this agenda, isn't what we do in school and then we'll think about that later, but it becomes that whole landscape around the nature of learning and where it occurs is pivotal to any of the conversations we have. So I think I'm now going to pass to John, who's going to give us a little bit of background around the actual Family School Partnership Initiative.
Thanks, Mary, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and to talk about our little pet project and to join in the discussions and the dialogue that we've been involved in today, and I look forward to more of tomorrow. So when we think about those two questions, where does learning occur? What we had to really confront was that the evidence shows us clearly that it happens everywhere a young person is. And if we concentrate our efforts only in school, then it really limits our capacity to change the dynamics and change the outcomes. And you'd be aware Sharon Butler flicks this slide around, and I know she travels around to lots of school communities, and this is one of her pet ones. But less than 20% of the time in schools. If we don't look at building on and influencing outside school, it limits our capacity to change the lives and influence the lives of young people. Oops. And the other piece of evidence that we used was this one from West Burnham, Atira and Farrow's book, Variables Influencing a Child's Life Chances and Wellbeing. That the school is about 20%. The other 80% of influence is outside school. And what can we do in the social area? How can we help communities to build social capital? And some of the workshops that I've been part of today have already shown some outstanding examples of how schools and communities work together to build social capital. But it is the key to change. And how can schools and families work together to influence those personal factors? And so what is the nature of learning? In Catholic Education Office Melbourne, we have a framework around contemporary learning. And this framework, recently developed and released, is quite expansive, but it focuses on in-school only. It hasn't gone to, if contemporary learning is the way of the future, how to encompass learning inside and outside the school. And so if we stop at the school gate, if we think learning begins when kids arrive at school and are dropped off by the parents, and then it stops when they're picked up by their parents, we limit it so much, and it just plainly ain't true. So what did we do? We looked at, in Catholic Education Office Melbourne, we'd been running a project called Schools as Core Social Centres since 2001 or 2002 as a partnership project with Vic Health. And what we'd learned from that project was that there's great strategic value in schools working in clusters, getting schools to focus on their community, building the capacity of the school community, so school leaders, families, parents, students and people in the wider community, and recognising that it's not just teachers and educators who play a role in the education of young people. So they were the drivers that enabled us to sort of reflect on a number of years' experience and therefore build towards what we now call the Family School Partnership Initiative. So it was premised on the notion of not keeping parents behind a gate, to actually, as Don Edgar talks about, making the boundary between school and community permeable. So where it stops and where it starts matters not, because it's all a place of learning. So we had in Melbourne 35 low SES schools, 31 primary and 4 secondary schools. And the model that we've developed has not only been implemented in Catholic Education Office Melbourne, but in the other 3 dioceses in Victoria. But in slightly different ways, because in the other 3 dioceses, which are country dioceses, obviously the challenges they face in terms of school size and distance between schools is quite different to that we face in Melbourne. So 35 schools. So we established 13 family school partnership convener positions. Strange title for a job, but one thing we wanted to do was not have a title that had been used before and probably didn't mean a great deal. Because we wanted it to evolve, we didn't want it to be constrained by parent liaison, community liaison, or anything else that pre-existed. And so when we explained it, we tried to avoid using that, because we wanted it to evolve based around the school's needs. So 13 conveners, each convener they were employed by Catholic Education Office Melbourne, and they were located or based in a school, working with a cluster of schools, between clusters of 2, 3 or 4. The clusters were essentially made up on geographic determinations. So we took the schools that were given. Some of the clusters don't make a great deal of sense, and if we had our time again, we'd probably do it differently, but we don't have that time again, so we've learnt something. Each convener, therefore, is in a base school working with a number of schools. Each school, in addition to the convener, gets a brokerage grant, a professional learning grant, and they also get a literacy and numeracy grant. The grants, the school it goes to each individual school, and the school has determination over how they spend those funds. The brokerage grant, we try and encourage schools to develop plans in conjunction with their family school partnership convener, and in most cases that's what they do. The school leadership works with the convener to work out a plan. So in year 1 our focus was on relationships, building relationships in the school between the convener and the school leaders, between families, building relationships with school staff, getting to understand community, helping school leaders and teachers in school get a deeper understanding of their community. So that meant responding a lot of demands from school in terms of the sorts of programs, activities that they would like to see initiated. So year 1 was a bit of helter-skelter and almost anything goes. Year 2, our theme was Ready, Fire, Aim from some Fulham's work. We took it that we'd done the Ready Fire. It was now time to try and be a little bit more strategic in terms of our work and where we focused our energy. And during that time saw a number of themes emerged. Family engagement in learning was central. Social inclusion, culture and identity was also central. Of our 35 schools, all but 2 or 3, the primary sort of factor that makes them low SES is high migrant and refugee populations. Some schools as many as 42 different nationalities and languages. So culture and identity and understanding that culture is important. Another theme was early childhood. Again, when we worked with our schools, our conveners worked with our schools, we were finding that up to 30% of kids were starting prep with no experience in kindergarten at all. Sudanese families might have had their kid in a childcare or a playgroup, thinking that was kindergarten, but no understanding that it wasn't a formal kindergarten program. So they start behind the 8 ball. So many of our schools have picked up on this theme of how they engage more effectively in the early childhood area. Transition from kindergarten into schools, from primary school into secondary school, from secondary school into employment. Outward-facing schools, so school community partnerships became a theme. And last year we conducted a conference Look Out 2011 with the focus on outward facing, and we developed a charter for outward facing schools, which there's copies of here if you're interested. And we also had the theme of the language of learning and learning at home. How do we promote schools adopting language that families understand? Every industry has their own language, but if we're communicating with families and community, we've got to be prepared to change our language if we want to have our messages understood and if we want to have real dialogue. And learning at home, how do we promote learning at home so that time outside the classroom can be properly responded to? So that was the Ready, Fire, Aim. We established those themes. Our third year, which is this year, our theme is activities to impacts. We want to stop talking about how many activities we do, adding another activity. We want to start to talk about what's the impact and what's the process that needs to be undertaken to change behaviour, to change thinking, to change the results. If we want to have an impact, we know it's not just what we do, it's the process that we go through. So our conversations this year have all been around how do we talk more about the impact and less about just what we do. Our work is focused a great deal on building capacity. So throughout the project, the 2.5 years so far, we've worked with Sharon Butler's been working with a lot of our schools, as has George Otero, Danielle Cronin, Maggie Farrer from UK, and later on this year, Anne Henderson is coming out. So we've really put an emphasis on, if we want to change people the way they behave, we've got to build their capacity. It's not just about awareness and understanding. It was quite clear that at the end of the first year, there was much greater awareness of the importance of the role of family and parents. There's much greater understanding of the important role that schools could play in embracing them in the education process. But how? And so the emphasis on PL has all been around building their capacity to really connect with their community more effectively, to engage with their parents and engage the parents not just in the life of the school, but in their child's learning. And having discussions around what does engagement mean. Engagement does not equal attendance. It means absolutely working with, understanding and encouraging the child in whatever way they can best do that. So we're still at an early stage of our journey and we've got lots to learn. How do we then embed some of this in the way a system works, in the way schools work individually, but also in how they work collectively? We know from conversations with communities and school leaders that the impact on some schools, some staff, some school leaders is profound. For some it's significant, for some it's just a bit. How do we maintain that work and turn it into a transformation that can be sustained over time? And Mary will pick up on that theme.
One part of the model that John forgot to mention was his amazing leadership in this. So John's been centralised in the system and he is effectively the manager, the leader of these 13 family school partnership conveners. And as a model, as John said, we're just reflecting and learning all the time and we've got so much to learn. But having that, if we go back to that tri-level, that we wanted to have an impact not just on what the schools were doing, because they were doing great things, some of them already, what was the impact long term? What will be different? If all the funding dries up, what's left behind that will completely reshape the system around this? So John's leadership in the system, but around these 13 family school partnership conveners, and the way he went about that leadership by engaging and building relationships with leadership teams, with schools, with regional-based people, with system-based people, really demonstrates how long it takes to bring about change, because where you see the biggest impact at the moment is in some of the schools. And as John said, there's a complete continuum, but certainly a major shift. The influence of those schools, John keeps telling me, will be like an avalanche that comes back and reminds the system that this is the work that needs to do. But his leadership also is within the sector and within what we're trying to do. So there's challenging conversations that when we talk about literacy and achievement, when we talk about in-school factors, we keep on extending out. So as a model, it wasn't about put the people out in the schools and let's hope that can affect change. We really were trying to model those 3 levels the whole time. So if we all get to what our collective dreams are and being here, and there was a challenge in the previous, Sharon and I were chatting before, we often don't need to build parents' capacity. They're there, they have the capacity. We need to be able to build the so-called professional capacity to recognise that and to have the professional expertise to know how to work with people in respectful ways that actually validate the contribution they're already making and don't lock it into a lens of how we see parent engagement or parent involvement looking. So I think although sometimes the privatised nature of educators means that we go back to pedagogy, it's about actually reshaping and reframing. What are we talking about when we talk about pedagogy if the evidence is very clear around this in terms of coming back to the core purpose around achievement? So we're hoping that as we continue this journey for another 18 months with this level of funding, if it ends there, we've failed as an innovation, as a disruption. But we're hoping that because of the shared collective wisdom that's happening across it, there'll be something different left in the system. There'll be some reorientation of the system, some new understandings of the system. And some of those in our dreams would look like that into the future, when we talk about learning, there may be a refocused narrative around that. When we talk about the place of learning, there may be a reshaping and the understanding about that. When we talk about contemporary learning or literacy or achievement or driving, that we automatically talk about the place of families in that space. When schools go through school improvement and they're identifying particular goals and objectives, we don't talk about community as the added extra, we talk about community as driving the learning outcomes, and that just becomes the flavour. We know that won't happen within 18 months, but we're hoping that through working with the university, through working with leadership teams, through working at central office and region, there'll be a legacy behind that continues to drive the momentum. I had a wonderful opportunity as part of one of the other things we do in this space, which are study tours to Santa Fe a couple of years ago. And one of the biggest impacts on me was a wonderful woman I met who was lucky enough to be in a community that had validated her wonderful contribution as a parent, even though English wasn't her first language, even though she wasn't formally educated to any great degree. But she talked about the spirit of welcome, and she talked about her growing confidence, how that at every occasion she was validated as the first educator. And so in very clear English as a second language, she put this together to a group of sort of professionals and educators and bureaucrats, which stopped us all and had us in tears, because this was, and then she took out a photo, a really kind of weathered little photo that she was very proud of, and showed her first son having graduated from university. And not that university is the measure of success, but for her son, that's what he wanted. And for her as a parent, she wanted what was best for him. And so it was just a fantastic story. So just to finish up, as we pass on to our next speakers, to tell this story, we're trying to gather evidence along the way, but we've engaged a longitudinal piece of research too, and which reflects the model we've talked about. It's not about trying to measure what schools are doing differently, because we've been measuring that for years, but it's not sustained and it doesn't push back and change systems. So the research is trying to measure the impact at the 3 levels of the system. And we're not sure how well we'll go with that, but we're trying. So it's a 3-year longitudinal research. So the real challenge for us will be that the indications are the research is positive in that progress is being made. But it keeps coming back to the fact, like for all of us in this room, if we know that's true, what will be different? And how can the collective energies of the people in this room and across Australia be joined together to know where's our greatest impact, where's our greatest push, which doors do we go through to start to reshape this? And we know it's not one door, otherwise we're back to the earlier slide. What's the one thing we do? But where are the key doors to come together collectively around to make this difference so that it is sustainable? Thanks.